Once your development is selected, whether it be traditional, conventional, a cluster, or your conservation, each lot has a specific standard that it can be built on, and these are called lot standards or design standards. You have a front yard setback. That means your house can't be any closer, or even a porch that can't be any closer to the property line. Then you have side yard setbacks. That means you can't build anything in these areas. So when somebody says, what's the setback, they mean, what is the buildable area? In this one has a 30-foot setback to the building, 10 side yard setbacks, and a 25-yard rear setback. That means everything in the hatched area is the only place that you can build your home. You also have design clusters. So this would be a single family where one house is on there, and might even be in a detached garage, but then you have multifamily or even townhomes that are combined on one lot, and they share a lot line, which means that they would have zero distance between the houses, because it's actually essentially one house and it's a duplex of some sort. But they also have minimum standards. You have a minimum lot size standard, you have a minimum house size standard, you have front yard, rear yard, and side yard setbacks. In this, we're looking at site characteristics. You can see these values right here. Those are actually your contour elevations. So it goes 10, 20, 30, 40. When you're working on developing it, your subdivisions, you want to make sure that you take into consideration the actual site contours, because you're going to either have to fill an area or you're going to have to excavate an area. Like, do I take all this dirt from this 40-foot contour and put it down to the 10-foot contour? We have to think of these things when we're building our roads and when we're setting our houses for finished floor elevations. The other thing is some developments have grid-like patterns for subdivisions. That actually changed back in the day because they didn't want long distance views of just a long street and then house, 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 house. So they started doing meandering streets or curvilinear streets. So it would provide, instead of a straight line of sight, your line of sight would be blocked by the movement and the pattern of the street itself and the houses. They also want the streets, instead of a long straight stretch, you know what happens on a long straight stretch? People keep accelerating, and that's not really good in a subdivision with kids. So they put the curvilinear in there to reduce the speed down also. It also helps the pedestrian movement. The other thing is the circulation. So you don't want to have streets that have offset roads, that when you come to an intersection, the intersections aren't, facing one another, and it's just, you don't have like a street and then a street that comes down here, whereas the other street comes this direction. You want to have intersections, four-way intersections, so it provides a better coherent circulation of traffic. And also, when we're laying out our yards, you can tell in here we have smaller lots and larger lots and even larger lots. Well, a developer does this for a few reasons. One, to sell to different levels of the economic development out there. But also, with each types of the lots, you have to ensure that they meet that lot design standards, the setbacks, to make sure that they have the proper building envelope and sufficient yard privacy, meaning you don't want somebody that's back to back each other that you're now looking in their back window. Not only do you have single family lots or single family dwellings, but you have semi-detached dwellings and single family attached dwellings, whereas the semi-detached might be referring to a duplex unit, where a single family attached dwelling could be multiple types of dwellings, like apartments or even townhomes. So townhomes can have a layout like this. This one has no garage, where that one does have a garage, but take a look. Each of the townhomes is actually up and down in pattern. So not everybody has like an apartment building where everybody's face has the exterior is all at the same face, whereas they have different faces here. This one has garages within them and has driveways in the front. Whereas you have a townhome layout as such, where you can see buildings, and again, it's not as easy to see, but all of these have different front elevations. And there are some subdivisions where your townhomes will actually have different colors for each building. So each portion will be a different color or have some type of a different aesthetic feature. And a lot of these developments, especially the townhomes, like I said, have the rear alley access, so the garages will be in the back. And sometimes the garages are detached from the townhomes themselves. So like we were talking about townhomes, then we have the residential family, meaning an apartment complex. So you have a common wall, and then there might be apartments on each side of it, and there's multiple floors. So you'll see the multifamily residential in a higher density residential neighborhood. So let's go over a list of site design development criteria. When we're looking at developing a subdivision, we have to look at the zoning first to see what type of development we can put in there. Is it multifamily residential? Is it single family residential? Is it high density? Is there a lot of houses, or do I have to put a few houses per acre on there? We also have to look at the planning documents. We go to the counties, the cities, and we pull the documentation that we have to submit. So if the zoning is agricultural and we want to go to residential, then we have to do a zoning amendment to our project. We also have to go by the guidelines and the criteria that the government already set up for us on what our development looks like. If we don't follow that criteria, then we have to pull a variation amendment or an exception to the rule type of application. We also are looking at the density. When somebody says density, they mean how many houses per or how many units per acre can I put on there. So the different zoning code says that, or the different zones are allowed, like R1, R2, R3, R4. As the numbers increase, in this instance, the number of units per acre increases. We have to also look at what our area is encumbered by. Do we have wetlands that we have to preserve? Is there a conservation easement that's already on the site? Or is there a floodplain where we have to take into account? We can't build in a floodway. We can build in a floodplain, but you can't build in a floodway. We also have to take into consideration what the ground actually looks like. Steep slopes. Do we have to transition from a high elevation down to a low elevation? We talked about grading the previous class, and we have to tie back down to natural grade. We also have to take into consideration major easements. Like when you buy a piece of property, like my parents' property in Kentucky has a large utility easement that goes through their 20-acre parcel. It's an overhead power line. So maybe there's already a public right-of-way that's on the development that we have to take into consideration, and we can't build on, so we have to build around it. We have minimum acreage accessible for certain lots. It goes back to your zonings. Those standards, those building site standards, what is our front, rear, and side yard setback? That tells us how big our building envelope is, and then we have to say, okay, within this envelope, the actual structure of the house has to be a certain size. Minimum, this is what I just said, minimum yard setbacks, so we have to develop within those areas. The other thing that we need to take into account is if you have, let's say, a 10-acre parcel and you're subdividing it, within that 10 acres you have to have common space, whether it's an open space, passive recreation, active recreation. A lot of the counties and cities require this as part of your development. So yes, you can build 10 houses, but you also have to have a half acre of a playground or something that's an open space, basically a green space. You also have to take into account when you're designing not just the open space, but how large the development, let's say it's 10 acres again, typically the site has to drain somewhere, and we have to collect all of our runoff in a pond. Well, that development also has to have a certain percentage of stormwater pond available to it. So now with minimum open space and ponds, it reduces the development size. So maybe instead of being an R1 where it's, so many acres per lot, so you have to go in R4 to increase the density. So you're getting back the number of units that you can build because of all the losses in the minimum open space and the ponds. Now, we have a maximum lot coverage also that you have to take into account. Again, goes back to the zoning of that property.